Yes, we have you now, Shazia.
Yes, yes. Please begin.
Okay. Distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Sustainable World Air Quality Asia, I would like to welcome you all to this event on accelerating climate finance through the loss and damage finance mechanism. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules for this important task of developing solutions that will meet the challenging need of climate finance for vulnerable countries through a public-private partnership. Having served for 24 years as a Member of Parliament in Ireland, I was very honoured to join Air Quality Asia, an international parliamentary advocacy group, as its treasurer. Since 2016, Air Quality Asia has been working with high-level policymakers to implement the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030 and the Paris Agreement by helping governments across Asia to strengthen national environment and energy policies. Nations around the world are experiencing increasingly destructive impacts of runaway climate change. Since 2000, over 4 billion lives have been impacted and $2.9 trillion lost to disasters, the bulk of which are attributed to extreme weather events from climate change. These impacts are considered loss and damage consequences incurred by climate-related events that exceed what nations can recover from. Loss and damage consists of economic impacts, such as damage to livelihoods and property, and non-economic impacts, such as loss of life, biodiversity, and cultural heritage. These impacts are caused by both rapid onset extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, and slow onset events, such as sea level rises. In 2022, there were 37 separate billion-dollar rapid onset weather disasters globally, costing over $313 billion. Nations in the global south, especially those part of the V12 nations, most vulnerable to climate change, are suffering from loss and damage due to limited fiscal space to invest in recovery and adaptation measures as a result of high debt burdens and insufficient economic resources. If we do not mobilise sufficient resources to tackle the issue of loss and damage funding now, the impacts of the problem will run out of control. Ending the financing of fossil fuel development and instead prioritising investment in growing clean, carbon-free economies will bring immediate benefits. It will save many lives. It will improve human and ecological health as well-being, whilst bringing greater prosperity for all. I hope that this meeting will accelerate this progress. I would now like to hand the floor over to Shazia Rafi, President of Air Quality Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, MJ. Before I make my introductory remarks, I wanted to introduce Honorable Fariz Ismailzadeh, who is a member of the Parliament from Azerbaijan, and he also is the Vice Chancellor of their university. So he will welcome us as the host country, and then we will proceed with the program. Fariz.
Thank you so much. You forgot the most important sentence. I'm the globe champion, globe parliamentary champion. I'm very proud of that.
That's right.
Dear colleagues, once again, welcome to Azerbaijan. Welcome to COP Summit. Very honored to be here with you. I am an educator, but as far as I understand, the finance issue is the most important issue to the climate change. I have been hearing a lot of stories about how the banks and generally finance organizations should support the climate change process, the fight against climate change. And recently at my university, we organized a conference with Azerbaijani banks. And Azerbaijani banks together have pledged almost 2 billion manat, Azerbaijani manat, to, it's kindly roughly around $1.5 billion, to help the transition into green economy and to help the companies, the enterprises. I think this is quite a good contribution from Azerbaijani financial sector. And as a government of Azerbaijan, we have prioritized the finance issue. We have been focusing a lot on this loss and damage fund. And I think that in the future, Azerbaijan as a country, which has provided a lot of assistance to developing countries through humanitarian assistance, development projects, educational projects, medical projects, I think that Azerbaijan will be very interested to participate in this process. We have already pledged a lot of assistance to our neighboring countries. And in the future, I think that this loss and damage fund will be very important for Azerbaijan, especially in the context of island states, small developing countries. As you know, Azerbaijan has been chairing non-aligned movement for 4 years. So we have very good dialogue with developing world. And I think that in the future, we will focus on that a lot. On my part, I will encourage members of parliament in Azerbaijan to discuss these issues a lot, both in the legislation and among the stakeholders, companies, voters, and constituencies. All the best wishes to all of you, and I wish you fruitful discussions.
Thank you, Honorable Fariz. So I will just give a little background of how this particular project that we are presenting today fits within the context of both climate change and the work on the official loss and damage fund set up by the UN FCCC and the World Bank. So Sustainable World Inc., which is the parent organization, and its project AirQualityAsia have worked since 2017 with parliamentarians and governments in South and Southeast Asia on health and economic impacts of air pollution and climate change. We are an observer at the UN Environment Programme, observer at UN FCCC, affiliated with the UN Department of Global Communications, and a civil society attendee and panelist at the World Bank. We have all globally witnessed an unprecedented time these past 4 years with the COVID-19 pandemic and the exacerbations of climate change. Almost 7 million lives have been lost to COVID-19. Parallel to this pandemic is a silent killer which continues to claim 9 million lives annually around the world, and that is rising carbon emissions of air pollution, which is the other side of the coin to climate change. The same carbon emissions that make air quality worse, next slide, you can see that, those are the 4 elements that increase carbon emissions. Those same carbon emissions are the ones that make climate change worse, and you get the 4 impacts that you see on the right side. So we have to come up with a way, because this global warming leading to climate change disasters, they are increasing in frequency and intensity, and they are spreading all over the world. Since climate change is hard to measure, air quality monitoring gives you parliamentarians and policymakers a way to measure progress or failure in real time. And right now I'm from Lahore, I'm headed to Lahore, we are seeing failure in real time. The challenge for developing economies is that as they industrialize to increase their GDP and give better living conditions for their citizens, carbon emissions and air pollution increases. As air pollution has no boundaries, neither does climate change, the impacts from these fast-growing economies of the Asia-Pacific region has grown now to hazardous levels around the world. They are also impacted themselves. A decade ago, in November 2013, we formed the Parliamentary Working Group on Clean Air. Pakistan was part of that working group, and the Chairman Senate, Nayar Bukhari, was the one who proposed at the UN the right to clean air, added to a resolution at the IPU meeting in November 2013. This was adopted, and we did a year's worth of intense negotiations to get the UN SDGs 3 clean air targets. These were approved by September 2015 by all governments who are members of the UN. They are specific, they define the sources of air pollution, the mechanisms for implementation and monitoring. So when governments say, you know, we don't know what's causing it, we don't know what we have to do, it's all clearly there, and they've all signed on. In the parallel process, all countries also signed and ratified the Paris Agreement on climate change, which legally binds them, because their parliaments have ratified them, to an overall global cap on carbon emissions total. So the issue is not that we have to do it. We've already said we have to do it. We've already signed on. We also know how to do it. It's where to get the money and the will to do it. The will lies with you, members of parliament. The money lies, unfortunately, in the private sector. So the issue I think that we are dealing with, and now the impact is being felt everywhere. I live in New York. Last year, the flooding flooded the New York subway system completely. It had to be shut down. California now has the largest, most intense wildfire season, which lasts most of the summer, destroying a lot of the property. Insurance companies have stopped insuring the Pacific coast. So clearly there is a very huge economic impact. But wealthy countries like the United States have domestic finance that is robust enough to be able to absorb the climate impact. It is vulnerable countries from the developing world who don't have the credit rating to go to the private markets who are the ones really affected. Countries like the Marshall Islands, Tonga, Marshall Islands is already in a permanent relocation program for their entire population. The Maldives has run out of drinkable groundwater because the sea level has risen so much that the water is salinated. They also have to look at a long-term immigration. Fiji has relocated 12 towns and villages to higher ground on a permanent basis and given that beachfront land back to the ocean. The biblical scale of floods in 2022 in Pakistan, where it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, displaced 33 million people. We are still recovering from it. So this is loss and damage on a global scale. The issue that we face now is that it's a climate justice issue as well, because the loss is faced by those who did not cause the damage. And so Pakistan was one of the G77 countries that led the discussion at COP27 to create a loss and damage fund for the UN to recognize this climate justice issue. The decision was taken at COP28, a dedicated fund has been created, and COP29 is still wrangling with the issue of how to get more public money into that fund. The fund is supposed to be managed by the bank, the World Bank. Now, one thing it's important to note here, that the historic emissions are not by country and region alone, they are by company. So it's not the poor person living in Flint, Michigan who is doing the damage. It is the large corporations in all these countries that are doing the damage. They are from the energy generation, fossil fuels, polluting industrial production methods, low quality transport fuels, construction industries, high per capita consumption in developed and now in rapidly developing countries. Our people also want to have the modern lifestyle. So what we are doing here at UNFCCC is this Herculean task to marshal public funds to meet the climate needs. But the gap between the public funds and the climate needs is too huge. The total needed on a climate basis is anywhere from $5 to $8 trillion. And the amount gathered so far is 720 million. And the chances with the new US administration coming in of getting even $1 out of them is. So our premise was that governments only have 10 to 15% of the money, and even that is very hard to get. I can't imagine parliamentarians in developed countries saying we need money to be able to give to those whom we've caused damage to. The money is sitting in the private equity markets. So how can one design a mechanism which would incentivize these markets to invest in climate finance, would de-risk their investment to zero, and would somehow or the other get them to begin doing climate projects? And not just climate projects in the big countries whose economies are good, but climate projects in the vulnerable countries whose economies are not good. The task ahead is sobering in its gravity and size, but it's not impossible. I would like to share an example from the late 1980s and early 90s. We faced a regional economic crisis in Latin America on a comparable scale. The Latin American economies faced default under debt burdens, largely from US banks and MDBs. At the time, the US Treasury Secretary Nick Brady took a courageous political decision to save both the regional and American banking system through a Treasury bond securitization, a zero coupon bond that brought the risk of investing in these countries, lending to these countries to zero. And that did not require a requisition from Congress. This program, which was called the Brady Bonds, at that time raised $65 billion, which in today's dollars is over 1.6 trillion. So you need mechanisms of that nature with that level of political will. But that political will is now necessary from three institutions, and there the interface that you have as members of parliament with their members of parliament is important. The first, despite it being going to be President Trump, is the US Treasury. You still have to talk to them. You have to talk to your colleagues who are in their finance committees, because they have to play a major role in securitizing this private climate investment. The European Central Bank, which is the equivalent of the Treasury, and they too have to undertake doing this level of securitization of green and blue bonds in vulnerable countries. The last is the Bank of China. So they are, I think, a little more amenable, but I think still it means that there has to be an interaction with their government, a demand that they do the same, and that the three work together, because it's a global crisis. So it's a very big challenge. So as an organization that works with MPs, mobilizing political will is something we are there to help with. We are based in New York. We go to Washington to the bank meetings, to Congress. To sum up, we all have to do our part. Developed countries must speed up and expand their transition to green economies. We're going to face a real challenge in the US because we now have a president whose favorite slogan is drill, baby, drill. So we have to make sure that the green transition, the IRA, the green economy in the US does not suffer, that state governments come in to continue down that path and don't let the US roll back as a country. Multilateral banks must leverage their power to accelerate concessionary capital to do the same in the V20 and developing countries, which means your own transitions to a green economy are very important too, because every bit that you can avoid more damage to your local economy, to your local environment, to the regional environment is very important. Business leaders are the hardest one, but you as members of parliament have the capacity to influence business leaders in your regions. You have to get them into this green transition. Whether it is through some kind of carrot or stick method, through your powers of legislation, your powers on taxation and subsidy, that is where you've got to do it. And you have to stop subsidizing the polluting industries. You also have to work with civil society because their combined power is needed for a global green transition. So as a first step, we set up an expert advisory group for the LDFM, comprising climate finance experts from key countries to develop solutions that will bridge this gap between a compensation model, which is the official fund, and the investment model, which is what we are working on. Today, I'm pleased to present the preliminary results from the EAG Working Group 1 and Working Group 2. I would now like to hand over to Mr. Monish Mahurkar, who is our Technical Support Unit Head, and ask him to start the deliberations with the experts. Monish, you have the floor.
Thank you, Shadia, for setting the context and that background. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here to talk about probably one of the most important issues of our time. And as you explained, Shadia, that the key question for us is today how to find the required level of financing, the extent and the type of financing required to address these solutions. Clearly, there is a huge gap. There is not going to be for a very long time and probably never the amount of sovereign or government or donor support available. There is a significant amount of capital in the private sector. The question is, how does it actually move? How does that actually get allocated to these solutions? So before I turn over to our panel members to offer some insights, maybe I can just summarize how at least from my perspective, I view climate finance. So, we can think about it essentially in three pillars. The mitigation part of it, financing reduction of emissions, is probably the best understood. And that is also an area where probably much more progress has already been made. And we have had a significant amount of private capital flowing into mitigation finance. The second pillar, which is harder, that is adaptation, which is recognizing that we are already in a warming world. We need to make our infrastructure more resilient and adapt to the likely effects of climate change. So that's the second pillar, where we have seen some investment, probably again more from governments, but with some limited private sector participation. The third pillar, which has become much more significant, is the real focus of today's deliberations, which is loss and damage finance, which is knowing and recognizing that damage will already happen with the impact of climate change. How do you actually recover from that damage? How do you protect against that damage? And how do you finance the required level of saving human lives and livelihoods? So those are the three pillars. And the third one is probably the most difficult one, the most difficult nut to crack in terms of mobilizing the private sector, simply because generating returns, economic returns on loss and damage finance will remain quite hard. So with that little bit of background, let me now turn over to our panel members, perhaps starting with Dr. Viral Acharya, to share a little bit of his insights from the working groups reviews that we did in the space of attracting private sector. And then I will turn over to Dr. Nana to share some of his experience from Indonesia.
Before Viral speaks, I just wanted to say that Dr. Viral Acharya was the former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and now is a professor at the Stern School at NYU on climate risk.
Monish, I just want to confirm you're able to see the screen.
Yes, we are, and hear you as well.
Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's great to hear all of you talk about this issue. As Shazia mentioned, I'm from Shazia's neighboring country, India, originally, and it's hard not to recognize the impact of climate change, especially global warming and the hot temperatures, drying up of the soil, especially in high exposed industries such as farming. So through that experience, especially during my stint at the Reserve Bank of India during 2017 to 19, as well as my prior work in how private sector could be brought into infrastructure financing, I thought the initiative that Monish and Shazia had put together was really interesting, which was how to accelerate private investments in climate finance. And I thought I'll just share some of the insights from the work we did in our forthcoming report, as well as some things that we have learned from the space of private financing of infrastructure in other parts of the world. So needless to say, this is a very large need. And I think there are different ways of thinking about it, which is that we have to manage the transition of going from, very high level of greenhouse gas emissions to reducing them to a level where we can maintain the temperature rise at, say, 1.5 degrees Celsius for the planet as a whole. Now, there are many estimates out there that economists and others and climate scientists have put together. And essentially, the transition to the green, of course, involves, phasing out of existing carbon emission intensive sources of energy. But of course, hand in hand with that has to be the investments in green energy sources. So technological transformation, technological innovation directed technical change, whatever is the fancy term one likes for this, has to happen in parallel with the phasing out of these greenhouse gas emission intensive fossil fuels. And on the right, we just have one estimate of such needs. You can see that it involves a mixture of investing in renewables, investing in electrified transport. And some of these are very big challenges. Many parts of the economy right now are not electrifiable. Think about air transport or maritime transport or peak load capacities in several industries. And so one argument usually given for continuing the reliance on existing forms of fossil fuels is that, there's no other way to meet peak load capacity. And so clearly technological transformation has to happen, which involves not just innovation, but also electrification of different parts of the economy at a fast pace. And, these numbers may seem large, but just putting them in the scale of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, they actually seem of the right order of magnitude. Now, I think Shazia already touched upon this, which is that, so one is that need for directed technical change. Simultaneously, of course, climate scientists recognize that another key pillar, maybe perhaps a second order pillar, but a key pillar has to be mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And recognizing that the transition risk and the physical risk challenges of climate finance are not necessarily separate, so that the incidence of physical risk, which has already increased dramatically over the last 10 years, in grand scheme of time, that might seem a short window. But even most climate scientists have sort of thrown up their hands saying, listen, we don't understand the pace at which the physical risk is manifesting itself. And so there's an immediate impact of that in terms of losses and damages. I was giving examples of Indian farmers, but of course there are natural hazards taking place, not necessarily the slow-moving heating of the planet, but just acute chronic stresses materializing in the form of damages that affect specific individuals, households, workers. And as Shazia mentioned, sometimes the insurance markets are not able to keep up with protecting the societies against these losses. And my sense is, whichever way one looks at it, whether it be paying for the cost of transition, whether it be undertaking investments in mitigation and adaptation, whether it be dealing with the damages that arise when hazards occur, I think one way or the other, the societies are going to have to recognize that there is some fiscal transfer and redistribution involved in dealing with climate change, which is that the impact on energy prices, the need to make investments are going to be felt stronger on the financially constrained parts of the society, such as poor households, small businesses, etc. So that creates its own need for financing, I would say, especially in lower income countries. And that is where the challenge of getting private finance actually to meet a part of the needs might be the greatest. Now, the good news is that if you look at the investor landscape, this is just meant to show that actually there's a very complex world out there. And I mean to highlight here the number of boxes as the number of possible types of players who could come in, which is that, in my view, when I looked at infrastructure finance for the world, it became clear that actually source of finance is not the problem. There's enough private financing in the world to fund the entire world's infrastructure needs. I would say probably the same is true even for climate finance. But what is the problem? The problem is that public sector players, which includes governments, green banks, development banks, climate funds, they might be willing to provide the financing without sort of, let's call it like too much of a risk return view of these financing. They might internalize the climate change externalities. They might be willing actually to provide guarantees and take on the first losses. They might be willing to absorb certain amount of losses, being public sector entities and benefiting from the externalities politically or just through climate change in the right direction. But that pool of money is not necessarily that large. Okay, so we're talking about low-income countries. So by definition, their pools of finance are not as high as government bodies, either because of lack of high tax revenues or because of lack of credible sources of borrowing for them. However, coincident with the rise of climate change has been this phenomenon that actually even the advanced economies of the world are now quite strapped fiscally. They have actually sort of bloated their balance sheets over the last 15 years. And many of them, as we saw in Europe, have even experienced sovereign debt issues of there. So it's reasonable to accept politically and financially that that pool of money is unlikely to be available in the large quantities that is available because they are hitting their own balance sheet constraints. The private sector, in contrast, has done reasonably well. If anything, some would argue that it was relatively deleveraged 15 years back. It has increased its leverage somewhat, but not at the scale that the sovereigns or the households had prior to the crisis in 07, 08. So it seems that private sector is the real pool of money one can tap into. That includes institutional investors, philanthropists, venture capitalists, and corporations, which I would include private equity and others who are mobilizing big pools of money. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge here is that they have a very risk-return view of the world. They don't just allocate finance. Even philanthropists think of their investments as funding social entrepreneurship. So they are keen to design mechanisms that ensure that if they are putting their money on climate change issues, that there's accountability of these funds, there is social impact at the end of these funds, it's going to the right places, and that there are some tangible mechanisms of progress in the countries, especially low-income countries, where such investments might be made. So what we are doing in our report is we've tried to look at a range of different possibilities. So here's a set of examples and case studies that I won't get into, but we looked at Indonesia's green corporate bond, which I think we'll probably hear more about very soon. We looked at the Green Guarantee Company, which is sort of like a public-private partnership to provide sort of guarantees to green projects. Debt for nature swaps, in which there's a certain amount of debt forgiveness in exchange for certain tangible actions being undertaken for preservation of nature. Just improving low-income countries, managing their balance sheets and FX risks better. Investments in adaptation, that's an example where the African Development Bank has led the initiative. And social success notes, in which notes are effectively sold to the private sector, but success, social success in this case, climate change, adaptation, etc., is being monitored through some public bodies. And based on this range of studies, so I want to stress this point here, which is that there's no sort of silver bullet here in our view, that one has to embrace a range of solutions that meet different types of these specific investors and different ways of combining them into what works for a particular country. Our recommendation is the following, which is that that we approach this issue of raising finance to meet redistribution needs, to meet technical change needs, to meet adaptation needs, and as Shazia stressed, to just ensure that the transition is in some sense just for the poorest countries and the poorest people in these countries, poorest businesses in these countries. We recommend 3 steps. One is that we identify and quantify the private sector capacities to fund loss and damage funding in these countries. What are the most likely sources here? In our view, large globally diversified firms, this could be global corporations, global insurers, private equity firms, many of whom have already made net zero commitments. They are potentially, in our view, the Stackelberg leaders of these changes. They have made their commitments to themselves becoming net zero. Many of them interpret that to mean that they are going to make investments in the three areas we discussed. Once again, to repeat, technical change, uh, uh, the adaptations, and third, the fiscal redistribution needs. They may or may not necessarily have each one of these fully on board, but we think they are the best positioned given their commitment to climate change and given their global presence to actually be Stackelberg leaders for these loss and damage financing. Second, and to me, this is the key, which is that even when you think about infrastructure financing in poor income countries, as I said, the problem is not the lack of finance. The problem is, can finance be made credible? Can finance be given the confidence that it will reach the places where infrastructure financing is supposed to go? Will the finance that is provided by the private sector in infrastructure finance create the kind of multipliers on growth that they are marketed when infrastructure financing is sought from private parties? The same way, selling climate finance to these private investors is going to require creating enabling environments. And we think this is where perhaps a lot of investments need to be made. If you look at a developed country managing its climate change, governments have bodies which are collecting granular data on hazards and quantifying and keeping archives of what damages are resulting from individual hazards. They are naming hazards, which makes it possible to write insurance contracts, because unless a hazard is explicitly acknowledged through a public body, the contract doesn't remain enforceable. In many countries, when insurance is being incentivized to be provided against these losses and damages, you need flexible insurance pricing. Even in the United States, actually, states are unfortunately beginning to intervene in the pricing of insurance, which then has resulted in a breakdown of markets in states such as California and Florida. And even if private sector was to partner with the governments to agree to a fiscal redistribution, they need to be sure that the transfers are going to be delivered in the places where they are supposed to go in an efficient manner, in an accountable manner. Creating these government capacities, country level capacities in low income countries, perhaps might be one of the best steps that we could take forward so that financing can then follow naturally. And third, the key piece, though, is that this is a big risk. Transition may or may not happen. It may not happen in a timely manner. Losses may materialize along the way to be large, potentially. And so private sector may perhaps not be willing to bear all the losses right away until they have a certain level of familiarity with a particular country or confidence in its environments and ability to direct financing. And so there may be a need to blend public-private finance. Again, this is a common insight from infrastructure finance that government bodies, multilateral bodies, infrastructure financing entities, they need to step in with a pool of funds to provide first loss guarantees or credit enhancements, which then encourage the private sector to actually, in quote unquote, leverage that first loss guarantee in a very, very significant way. So guarantees are one way. Another interesting way, which has also been explored in infrastructure finance, and again, that insight could be carried over, is that stage financing could be provided. That's an idea from venture capital, where perhaps public bodies provide the seed financing, but then they wean the climate change projects off over a period of time. And once initial rounds of success have been demonstrated, then private financing could actually step up. And so stage or
Viral,
seed
you have
financing.
just one more minute. Just
Yeah,
one more minute.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm done. Yeah. And then the last pieces of this are there's capacity in the developed economies, in their institutions, to directing technical change. A lot of progress has been made on green and renewable energies. In fact, I would say perhaps even some emerging markets are making rapid strides in this progress. how do we transfer this knowledge over to low-income countries to help them move forward? So these are the three areas that we recommend based on the case studies that we looked at. And these case studies are available in detail in our report. We'll be happy to share you the detailed presentation if that's of interest. Thank you, Shazia and Monish.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's, I think those are some great insights. And as we worked on some of these case studies, it again served to highlight how important these are. And if I had to just reiterate a couple of couple of the most important insights from this work, that in the case of attracting private sector capital, quite a bit of the onus also shifts to the recipient country, to the potential beneficiaries, because it's all about creating the right enabling environment so that the risk return equation for the private sector can be made to work. Now, whether that is through longer term stable policies to encourage private sector capital, or it is, as Viral pointed out, a certain amount of blending or de-risking offered through public support, all of these ultimately are required to make it attractive for private sector to come in and finance some of these most significant climate-related priorities. Now, in our case studies, as well as our review of climate finance overall, we certainly found that Indonesia is one country which has been a leader in this space, and some of our case studies actually picked up on some very innovative transactions done in Indonesia. So we're fortunate to have Dr. Nana Riana here to share his insights from Indonesia's experience and how this was made to work, and what can other countries, developing countries, learn from that experience. So, Dr. Riana.
Thank you, Mr. Monish. Good afternoon, everyone. It is very honored to be here. I'm very glad to share our experience, how we deal with loss and damage finance mechanism in our case, in Indonesian case. So, would you please share my slide, or do you want me to share our? Okay, that's it. So for the loss and damage finance mechanism, I would like to stress on two mechanisms in the case of Indonesia. First of all, I would like to please to next slide. First of all, would talk about instruments instrument context here. So in terms of instrument context, we've been knowledgeable, we've been recognized by the global that we are the pioneering the green sukuk issuance since 2018, and some of the use of proceeds of this green sukuk issuance are directing to recover the sustainable disaster recovery plans in the area, in Indonesian area. And also we issued blue bonds in 2022, and also this proceed of the blue bond also directed to mitigation and adaptation financing in terms of resilience to climate change. And in terms also on the instrument context, we also develop what we call as blended financing. I believe what Dr. Vira has mentioned before, that blended financing will involve financing not only from the government side, but also from the private sectors to develop sustainable financing. And the second context, we would like to touch on the institutional context in terms of disaster pooling fund in Indonesia. So for the next slide, so for our commitment to sustainable financing, we put it in our debt strategies, medium-term debt strategy. It means that we have very serious commitment to combat with the climate change and also to achieve our sustainable development goals. So in our medium-term debt strategy, we clearly mentions that we need to increase the development of creative and sustainable financing to support development financing and also to accelerate economic transformation to achieve the what we call as a green economy. So this is our commitment in terms of in medium term that we put this on into a higher priority, how we can achieve the sustainable development goals in the future. For the next slide, and also part of our commitment, we develop what we call as green sukuk or green bonds framework in 2018 that cover for how we can focus on the green sectors to deal with to handle with the mitigation and also adaptation activities, but we don't want to only focusing on the green sectors. In 2021, we upgrade our framework to be SDGs government sectors framework. In this case, our framework is not only cover blue sectors to deal with adaptation and mitigation activities, but also we deal with a blue focus as well as social focus. So in this new framework, we can say that our framework is much broader, not only cover the climate sectors, but also the blue sectors as well as the social sectors. So this is just to show you that we have a really high commitment to achieve our SDGs target in 2030 and also to achieve our national determined contribution in 2030 that we pledge our we put our pledge to reduce the house gas emission in glasshouse gas emission in 2030 by more than 32% if we do it by ourselves. And if we get international support, we have to achieve at least 42% of the emission reduction. For the next slide, please. So this is our thematic financing instrument in Indonesia. As I mentioned before, we issued green sukuks in 2018. In total, we issued in global markets until now is $6.6 billion in the global market. That the first milestone that recognized by the world that we are as the first issuer of the sovereign green sukuk. And also, we not stop there. In 2019, we also developed retail domestic green sukuks that we sell to the individual investor in domestic market by using online platform. In this case, that individuals investor can also participate in combating climate change by buying our retail green sukuk by only 1 million IDR, or it's about like $60 per tranche. Yeah. So this is how we can put and also drive our individual investor to be like more financial inclusion in our context. So by introducing our retail green sukuk in 2019, we can see that the participation of millennial generation increased significantly. If we for the previous issuance, when we issue in with the offline platform, it means that the individual have to come to the nearest branch offices of the bank just to buy our retail sukuk. By introducing our online platform, and individual can buy by using mobile phone, website basis, and so on. So this is very handy for young generation. That's why by introducing this mechanism, the number of participation of young generation increased until like 50% of the total investor of the retail green sukuk. And we also, as I mentioned before, we also issued the blue bond in 2022, but this is in the Japanese capital market in terms of samurai bond. And all the things of this financing instrument also they are also directed addressed to resilient to climate change. That also very useful as a part of risk reduction in our country. For the next slide, I think for the next slide, this is the total issuance of our green sukuk, both in global market and also in domestic market. For the next slide, this is our blue bond issuance in 2023 and 2024. We can see here that the proceeds of this blue bond also also directed to address the disaster management and risk reduction, and also in pro-coastal vegetation plantation for disaster mitigation. And this is to confirm that both in the green sukuk and also blue bond, we specify this proceeds are to address the disaster pooling fund in our country. Next slide. For the next slide, this is also the allocation of green sukuk. Just to prove that our green sukuk allocation also support disaster risk reduction in terms of resilient to climate change for highly vulnerable areas, and also disaster risk reduction. And for this project, we also can say that the total emission of emission reduction until now is more than 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So this is also to support and also to prove that our commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emission justified. For the next slide, please.
Dr. Rihanna, one more minute. Thank you.
One more minute. This is my last slide. So in terms of institutional context, we now developing what we call as disaster pooling fund in Indonesia. But the development of this disaster pooling fund is until the progress right now. We still need to work together with ministries, with the line ministers from the national planning agencies, from the environmental agencies, to put this one into one scheme together. So the mechanism of this disaster pooling fund basically is how we can manage and pooling and collecting, recognizing and distributing specific funds that we collected from state budget, from municipal, from international support, and also from communities. And then we manage by using a special fund management institution, what we call it as public service agency. This public service agency will have authority to manage this fund, to put in investment, also to put in insurance, just to make like a commercial return. And then after have some like a good return, they're gonna have managed for the fund allocation, both from technical ministries, municipal, and also communities that they are in need to get the disaster pooling fund in Indonesia. So this is I think the basic idea what we call what we have done in Indonesia by introducing our disaster pooling fund. I think that's all my presentation. Thank you, Sasha. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rihanna. I think this is really interesting, and thank you for leading the way in both setting up very organized frameworks for addressing climate finance, including disaster risk financing, but also I think in looking at various innovative types of instruments, which I hope many other countries can learn from as well. One interesting point I picked up from the way you approached it, and I think that's quite useful to understand, is that good climate finance frameworks and policies are also good for development overall. So all of these, whether they pertain to overall longer term development or financing of infrastructure, as Dr. Viral alluded to earlier, the approaches to get private sector capital into these areas are very similar. So there are a lot of synergies across these areas which are worth looking at for other countries as well. So with that, Shravya, let me turn it back to you to take the program forward.
Thank you very much, Monish. And I am now going to ask the next panel, which is led by Honorable Naveed Kamar, who is a member of Parliament, chair of the Finance Committee in Pakistan, and also on the board of AirQualityAsia. Naveed, please come up to the podium. Joining him will be Honorable Cedric Frolick, who is chairing the Oversight Committee in the Parliament of South Africa. And the purpose here when we started this project was that part of the first part of the project is the experts who are developing solutions, but these solutions then have to be presented to the parliaments and to the relevant committees that have a finance, budget, oversight role as to what are the elements that would work, how would they work, what are the questions that the parliamentarians would have of this, so that when the final report is presented at the World Bank spring meetings, God willing, in 2025, that we have their comments and their interests included within the report. So with that, Honorable Kamar.
Thank you very much, Shazia, and thank you, panelists, for giving us an insight on where things are moving as far as the future climate finance is concerned. We, the parliamentarians in particular, are the ones who have our roots in the people and are directly responsible and answerable to them once we start seeing the effects of climate or climate change in our areas. The 2022 floods that Shazia alluded to, and then another flood that preceded that some 8 years prior to that. We have seen spread of water which was larger than most countries of Europe in just one single spell of rain that happened, destroying lives, destroying livelihoods, destroying agriculture for years at end, from which it becomes very difficult for people to recover. And yet, we have not, as a world, moved at the pace that is required. We have not as yet been able to shake up the conscience of the world that these are things that will, in the end, result in damages to the entire global economy. Where the world has woken up and has been able to move, we have seen that the effects, for example, the financing that we are talking about, after the 2022 floods, we launched what is till now the largest rebuilding housing project in the world. And we are still in the middle of it, where with help from the World Bank and other IFIs, we were given the financing for the housing projects in those areas that were affected by the floods and the rains. And today, because we were not only building, but we were, the slogan was to build better. When in subsequent years, and this is only the last 2 years, when the rains came back, those houses not only were able to sustain themselves compared to anything that was on ground before that, but became shelters for those who were not lucky enough to have been financed into rebuilding those houses in a better way. So the point is, if we get together and work on these issues, we can do better. But it requires a mindfulness, it requires a focus. We keep talking about various ways in which we can raise these funds. They're not enough, they are perhaps less than 10% of the requirement. But once we have been able to tap into those funds, then we, as the members of parliament, the onus is upon us to ensure that it goes back into the resilient projects that we are looking for. Because governments are constantly, the finance ministries are constantly in a deficit situation. And governments are constantly looking to find new ways of raising monies to fill their gaps, the fiscal gaps. But these monies at least should be protected. And that, again, as I said, we as parliamentarians have to ensure within our own parliaments and with our own finance committees that there are firewalls around these funds which are used primarily for climate resilient investments. They may be in transport, they may be in housing, they may be in overall sustainable agriculture. But once we have that, I remember Shazia when she started the AQA project and came to Pakistan and we had meetings with our parliamentarians. Nobody there was shaken up enough to start acting, with the result that today in her own hometown and a lot of us, there is a climate emergency that had to be. All schools are closed. Most businesses are closed, or at least their timings have been reduced to only 25% of what otherwise their times would be. And a lot of transportation has been brought to a grounding halt. So this may not be as big as COVID worldwide, but this is just as big in terms of its impact on the local population and the local climate. So the point is, if we don't act now, if we don't act today, it might be too late. And the cost that we will bear of not taking action in time would be much higher. That is something for us to raise in parliaments, that before we hit Armageddon, we have to take action. We have to plan, we have to be aware of these things so that tomorrow we don't have to shut down entire countries, entire economies. I think that should be a lesson takeaway from today. I don't want to go into the numbers in that because the disasters are much bigger than that. So please, let us follow the world in terms of being able to raise the funding worldwide, make it sustainable for those who will invest in those funds, but then to use it in a sustainable way within our own economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Kamar. Honorable Frolic, it's now over to you. If you have both comments on the presentations and also from the perspective of South Africa and the African continent, how this raising of loss and damage finance from the private sector, and you come from an economy that also has a robust private sector. So that blended finance concept might be of interest.
No, good afternoon and thank you very much. I agree with my colleague from Pakistan about the impact that climate change-induced disasters have on the livelihoods, especially also of the poor people in the poorer areas in our countries. South Africa has had its fair share of climate-induced disasters, and before coming to COP29 in my constituency, in an area, Kariga, within 6 weeks of one another, they suffered 3 massive flooding that wiped out public infrastructure and also the livelihoods of a lot of people. In 2022-2023, I had the opportunity to be the co-chairperson of an ad hoc committee to look at the disasters incurred by climate change in 7 of our 9 provinces, where we could have seen the devastation and also the greater inequalities that are brought about by climate change. Then there was a lot of hope, because at the UK Climate Change Conference, South Africa presented its Just Energy Transition investment plan, as well as an implementation plan on the back of an $8.9 billion facility that was created. But coming from a parliamentary perspective, the first question members of parliament asked, what is in there? What is the architecture looking like? And it came as little as no surprise to notice that 93% of it, of the funding that was made available, in fact, are loans. And in our parliament, we are very mindful of not putting future generations into a debt trap for disasters that was not caused by the very same poor people. However, we are acutely aware also of our responsibilities under the NDC. And there's various initiatives, of course, in South Africa, working in the greater African context, where we see the African Development Bank playing a greater role when it comes to the issuing of green bonds, hybrid bonds now, which includes the green bonds and the social bonds, to provide financing, working with international partners. But ladies and gentlemen, honorable members, the scale is simply too low. The commitments that are given are not, and that appears on paper from the international finance institutions, just remains ink on paper. And the difficulties associated with accessing the finance in the first place, and then secondly, getting commitment from the private investors is simply not there. It's proving extremely difficult. Now, I want to raise the following issue in terms of loss and damage, because before coming to this conference here, I attended another investment conference on green finance in Turkey, hosted by the Climate Parliament, and in informal discussions that was later confirmed coming to COP with fellow members of parliament from other countries, you can hear the negotiators now even talking about Article 6 that deals with loss and damage, saying that it's possible for the developed countries in the Northern Hemisphere to revisit their commitment under Article 6, loss and damage, and to say, but we also suffer loss and damage in our own countries, and why can't we offset the money that we put in place for dealing with damages in our own countries against the loss and damage fund? Now that will be the end of the loss and damage fund. And I think we must all be mindful of that, and we must encourage our country negotiators, especially us from the global south and those that are affected by the climate change-induced disasters, that it simply cannot happen. Any tinkering with Article 6 of the Convention will prove disastrous to the small island states, but also our countries that has been severely impacted upon. Yes, we as parliamentarians do have a responsibility to go back and look at our domestic laws, regulations, to ensure transparency and accountability for funds that are received. But we must repeat the call that the finance needs to be scaled up. It must be made more predictable. You must ask yourself the question, what is the eligibility criteria? Who qualifies? How do you access the funding? How predictable is it? Who stands first in line to benefit from it? Because that is the detail that is currently lacking. Saying that there is a loss and damage fund is highly commendable, but if it is increasingly uncertain and unpredictable in terms of its access, then it's going to become ink on paper that will be very, very difficult for the developing countries of the world to access. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And yes, it is the reason why we are trying to develop possible parallel complementary solutions from the private sector end rather than the official fund because of this ceiling on public finance into that fund. We now actually have one of our former members. She was a member of parliament, but then she got promoted to being deputy minister So I would like to welcome Honorable Diaroro ST Vidya Putri with us. She is now on the screen. Unfortunately, she is signed on as Sahar for some reason. We'll have to make sure. Hello, ST.
Hi,
Please.
I'm not sure why,
No,
but
no, no. I think they have to just fix the name.
okay.
Welcome, and please, you have the floor. Are you
Thank you
able
so
to?
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay over there?
Yes, we can hear you. Would you like
All right,
to?
perfect. Yes, all right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace and blessings be upon you all. I'd like to firstly convey my regards to Shazia. Thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of this incredible session. Honorable Naveed Kamar, MP from Pakistan, Honorable Tahir, MP from Azerbaijan, Honorable Cedric, MP from South Africa, Honorable Sahal Al-Bazar, MP from Egypt, Dr. Fariz, again from Azerbaijan, Honorable Matthew, Mr. Harry, Dr. Viral, Dr. Nana, and Mr. Monish, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I wish to be there. This is something that I attend annually, but given my recent post, and as well as the schedule that I have here, I'm unable to attend in person, but I'm grateful to at least be a part of this session today. Firstly, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to share with you regarding our government stance on the advancement of sustainable trade system for Indonesia. Second of all, I'd like to also extend my gratitude to the organizers, as you know, COP is a very intriguing, it's a very interesting space to be in, to be able to share multiple progress in which has been enacted within different parts of the world. As you might already be aware, we have the target of what we call as the golden age of Indonesia by 2045. So this is how we are optimizing on our demographic dividend, where a majority of our population are of the productive age, as well as our current president, Bapak Prabowo Subianto, is very keen in achieving an 8% economic growth rate by 2029. And on one hand, I also believe that trade facilitation and expansion is important to achieve these goals. And on the other hand, we also have to take into account the geopolitical and geoeconomic issues, as well as climate change, being that this poses a significant threat as well, and as well as the challenges that it may carry. And so what is more important is that we need to transform these challenges into opportunities, how we can then create an added or an additional value and improve people's welfare. For us, the issue of loss and endemic finance is an issue that has been discussed in recent years, and is not just a matter of equity or justice, it is also a matter of survival. And Indonesia, with its vast archipelago, we are one of the largest archipelagic countries in the world. We're very rich in our biodiversity, and we face direct threats of rising sea levels, you know, when this is accounting for many people's homes, and extreme weather events or patterns, and the shifting of agricultural patterns. And climate change has been disrupting livelihoods and has posed significant threats towards food security and straining our economic development. And the mechanism of the financing aspect should then acknowledge that while climate change is a global problem, the solutions can't also be a one-size-fits-all solution. And developing countries such as that of Indonesia are not responsible for the bulk of historical emissions, and this is kind of like a group impact. However, we are among the most vulnerable ones. And the finance committed to the loss and damage is therefore not a charity. If anything, it should be seen as a necessary investment in the resilience of our countries. and in the global effort to reduce the human and economic costs of climate change. Again, I wanted to amplify on the fact that this is a group effort, and I always stress during several COP conferences where developed countries who have reaped the benefits, for example, from the oil and gas sector, and have gone through an incredible process of industrialization, could then give aid to countries that are still struggling or are still either least developed or are developing countries, in order to then exchange with that regard. And this is something that I think should be considered in the years to come as well. And for Indonesia alone, we have the target of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by 32%. And this has increased quite substantially in respect and also in accordance to the target earlier, which was set in 29%. But again, there is multiple efforts that needs to be done, and across ministries is really important to then enhance the kind of collaboration. And this is something that Bapak Prabowo, our president, is always keen in pushing forward, how several ministries can work together in finding solutions to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. And I believe that this is something that a lot of other countries can implement. And I wanted to also stress on the fact that sustainable trade can play a pivotal role. For instance, this can enable mitigation and adaptation. And we acknowledge that trade has a role in providing access to the products, raw materials, technologies, and several necessary items to then support sustainable green economic growth. And I want to give you a little bit of an example of what is happening in Indonesia in recent years with regards to downstreaming of our natural resources. And this is something that the president is quite intent in fulfilling as well. With the abundance of nickel, for example, we are committed to creating domestic value added within the nickel industry, which supplies to other industries' production processes. And this includes automotives, electronics, household products, including battery for electronic vehicles as well. And again, electric vehicles are predominantly needed to then decrease greenhouse gas emissions within the transportation sector. And so this plays a pivotal role in enabling this in Indonesia. And this in itself is an example of our commitment to contribute to the global sustainability agenda, and how we can really just incorporate and create a sustainable future. And lastly, I wanted to also convey that as part of a joint initiative called Action on Climate and Trade, or ACT, developed by the WTO Secretariat, the World Bank Group, and the World Economic Forum, our government has been working with those organizations on priorities at the nexus of trade and climate change for the past 6 months. And these are just some of the things that we are currently trying to push forward. And there's also, carbon trade that is trying to be enacted in Indonesia. And we also need to acknowledge that when we speak of emissions, this is very much attributed to different sectors. And across ministries in Indonesia, we are trying to play our part in making sure that we do create that sustainable future. This is not an easy task, and is not something that can be done, with the blink of an eye, or through just flipping a coin. So I think collaboration and working together is really just key. And I wanted to end with the notes of what we call as gotong royong. And I always say this in every chance that I get is, and it has a very special meaning. It means how we can work side by side together and in achieving a particular target. And I do hope that through today's conversation, not only are we able to network and learn from each other's insights, but also be able to create that, perseverance in fighting for a better future for all. And I think that's really important to keep going and to always have that in the back of our minds. Shazia, thank you so much. And I hope this is useful and can be an added value to today's conversation. I wish to be there, I really do, but I hope I get to see you in another opportunity. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Honorable ST. I might add that, I'm personally very proud of what she has achieved as a deputy minister today, because the first time I met her, she had just come out of university and was just attending. Her father was on our board and she was sitting in the back taking notes furiously. So she clearly took the notes well. So Mubarak, thank you.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair.
So we are now at the close of our seminar, and I am going to hand over to our Secretary, Air Quality Asia, Honorable Harry Dunhoven, who is a former Minister of Trade and Transport, Energy and Transport from New Zealand. Harry, I leave it to you to close the meeting.
Thank you, Sarajia. Excellencies, honourable members of the National Assembly of Pakistan, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and greetings from New Zealand. As we conclude this insightful panel discussion on the loss and damage finance mechanism here at COP29, it's my privilege to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks on behalf of the organisers. First and foremost, I would like to express our deep gratitude to our distinguished panellists for their thought-provoking insights, their expertise on loss and damage finance mechanism. Your contribution today has illuminated the pathways for action and collaboration, and we are inspired by your dedication to this cause. We extend our gratitude to the Globe Parliamentary team, Ms. Meira, Mr. Oru, and Mr. Nicholas for daily coverings of parliamentarians on the crucial issues to be decided at this COP29. Your meticulous attention to detail ensured the event's smooth execution. We want to give special thanks to Honourable Dr. Fariz Ismailzadeh, MP, Director for the Institute of Development and Diplomacy, and the country of Azerbaijan for hosting COP29. I also want to thank Members of Parliament, Honourable Naveed Kamar, MP, Chair, Finance and Revenue Committee, Pakistan, who's also a board member of AirQualityAsia. Honourable Sahar Al-Bazar, MP, Deputy Chair, Foreign Relations Committee from Egypt. Honourable Cedric T. Froelich, MP, Chair, Oversight and Public Participation Committee, South Africa. Honourable Dia Roro Esti Widyaputri, Deputy Minister of Trade, Indonesia, AirQualityAsia, Indonesia. I also want to thank the members of the Expert Advisory Group, Mr. Monish Mahurkar, Acting Head Technical Support Unit, EAG, Dr. Viral V. Acharya, CV Star Professor of Economics, NYU Stern, Dr. Nana Riana, Deputy Director, Ministry of Finance, Indonesia. Finally, Shazia, a sincere thank you to you as President of Sustainable World Inc., AirQualityAsia, for convening this important meeting. Also to Matthew J. Nolan, Treasurer, Sustainable World AirQualityAsia, for his insightful welcome remarks, and to the staff, Dorota Piotrowska-Pelka and Denise Zainalova at AirQualityAsia for your dedicated behind-the-scenes work. It's been a pleasure listening to you tonight. I'm sorry I can't be there either, but it's a very long way to travel from New Zealand. And we are trying to cut down on emissions. So it's much better to do it by Zoom or Teams, whatever, Zoom. But can I say, we all really appreciate the huge work that you are doing to make this world a better place and to get on top of some of the problems that bedevil us at the moment. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you to everybody. I know there were many, many interesting events to attend, and we hope that this has led to some interesting questions on your part. We will be putting a lot of the slides on our website so that you can download them at your leisure. And when the final report itself is there, it will also be on our website. We hope to see some of you in Washington in April at the final session for the report. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.